good. Let me just whip through this to make sure it works. No, she said, I don't have your PowerPoint. I said, that was the whole point of sending it on Tuesday. Yeah. I know. Yep. Yeah, she's gonna be mad. She's gonna say, why did you do that? What do you mean you already see stuff? Okay. No, I just want to make sure everything's the way it is. It's supposed to be. Honey, can you take this? Oh, thank you. I love it. Thank you. Hey, that's exactly, you're the missional aspect to the end, my thing. That's right. Thank you. Exactly. Jump in. Okay. Morning. How are you? Yeah, good.
Now, our pastor said
He did.
Pastor Paul Berner.
Yes, that's a long time ago, though. Yeah, he was a year older than I was at seminary.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I told him I heard you speak 2 years ago.
Yes, I did, and he was a good basketball player.
He's tall enough.
Yes, he's tall enough, that's for sure. Tell him I said hi.
I will.
Okay, thank you. Well, I don't know. Yeah, that's what I heard. You know, it's just an interesting dialogue. Yeah, we'll take all the time we need to get this done right, you know. Yeah, they had me on Thursday, and then they moved me to the end. And so I'm like, most of the guys said, hey, you know, we really want to come, but we're on the plane. Yes, okay, that's all right. Rich. Rich, why don't you hand this stuff out now? Okay, while you're here already, before we get started, Rich and Carol are going to hand you some stuff out. Don't worry about this just now, but I want you to have these things. It's a way to find out all the information about what we're doing in Washington, D.C. And so since we have time to do that, we're going to pass these out. And the coin, for those of you who know Matthew 22, give to Caesar what is Caesar, give to God what is God's. You know, Jesus grabs the coin whose image is on it. So that was Caesar. I don't know if you saw Caesar walking around yesterday. That's him right there. So give him a hand, because he's Caesar. But, you know, because we're doing our work so well in D.C., we have limited him to now he does, you know, we said just sit here and listen what, you know. But Rich has been he was the guy that helped me when I was at Lutheran Hour. Well, he didn't help me do this. He did this. He was the guy that created the Men's Network. You know what I'm talking about? And the resources of the Men's Network? Yeah. And we actually, at that time, were actually merging the Lutheran Hour with the Men's Network because we felt that we had to come back to the church and resource the church. And we were even going to start recording the Lutheran Hour out among the church and build resources and identity with you guys in the community. That was our goal. Well, now that I'm doing this work in D.C., he's helping me develop what's called the Champions for Liberty churches. So as I talk a little bit today, if you go, man, I wish we had more time to talk about this, I do a weekend called a Champions for Liberty weekend with churches, circuits, and then we have a one-year process for you to become a Champions for Liberty church. Because we don't want you to become political activists. That's not what we're about, but we want you to learn how to engage the culture for the sake of the culture and for the sake of the church. And differentiating that is what our Lutheran theology tells us to do. So we need to train ourselves in that because nobody else is doing it this way. Okay? So if you want a Champions for Liberty weekend, you can just go on our website and sign up for that, and he's giving you all the ways to access that information. And I think we're about time to get started, so I think we will jump in. All right. Well, I'm glad you chose to stay and take a look at what we're talking about today, because in the coming years and months, this is going to be a huge issue for the church. We are going to have to learn how to fight for our right to be a public voice in the culture. But we're not we're not fighting for the gospel. We're fighting for the right to preach the gospel. But those Christians have a hard time with fight and serve. They don't, and so you're just going to have to learn how to differentiate those two words. In this area, we need to fight for this. In this area, we need to just lay down for this. And we have to differentiate that work. Because why? Because that's how God does it. And so we want to talk about that. So COVID-19, the Equality Act, religious liberty, and the mission and ministry of the church, they all go together. Okay? I hope by the time of this presentation you go, wow. And I'm really actually taking 3 lectures and I'm crunching them into 1 hour. So there's going to be some things I say, if you really want to know about this, I got to come out, we got to talk more, because that'll take another hour of this. But I'll give you the snippets of all those lectures so that you can go, wow, that's who we are, this is where we live, and this is how we can be the church in the middle of all this. Okay, I hope that's what you see. All right, so if you want to know more about us, here's some of the places where you can go, LCRLfreedom.org. I'm going to just say it as simply as I can. We are in Washington, D.C. to protect your public space to be the church. That's the only reason I'm there. Now, you may ask right now, why do we need to do that? I think I'll answer that in the next couple of slides. But the point is, that's all I'm doing. I'm not trying to politicize anything. In fact, we're the depoliticizing group in D.C. We're trying to say that's not a political issue. That's not a political issue. Leave that to the people. Leave that to the neighborhoods. Leave that to the families. That's our voice. In fact, and I'll show you how our two-kingdom voice is actually even attractive to some of our enemies on the Hill. Because it usually says, should the state do this? And I've even had some of our foes on the Hill say, well, we believe in the same role of the state. So yeah, we actually believe in what you're talking about there. We disagree with you about everything else, but we believe in that. So again, that's our voice on the Hill. And just in summary, what I do on the Hill, I'm an advocate for religious liberty, the sanctity of life, the institution of marriage, because marriage is more than a relationship, but that's a religious liberty issue for us. See, that's a little bit different than saying I want the state to define it properly. No, we just say don't let us not be able to be ourselves. And then finally, educational freedom, because if you cannot raise your children in the values of your home, then what's the point of any of these things? I said sanctity of life. My wife is telling me I missed one. So we're an advocate. We're not a lobby group. Okay, I do not lobby. The second thing I do on the Hill, we advocate, we get involved with lots of different folks on the Hill, and we speak to issues, but we don't necessarily take on legislation and lobby senators and congressmen. But then what do I do with senators and congressmen? I'm an encourager on the Hill. So I actually have a pastoral role on the Hill. I meet with a lot of people that generally share our views on those things, but then try to provide pastoral opportunities. So if they want to talk about these things, and they want to talk about it off the record, or ask, what does the church think about these things? What does your church think about these things? Then I make myself available. We especially gather the Lutherans on the Hill. But anybody who believes in two-kingdom engagement, and there are evangelicals who believe this, you'd be surprised, and there's even some Catholics, although the Catholic Church has its own voice that's pretty powerful on the Hill. But we work with all those folks, okay, as an encourager and as one who speaks the truth in love from our perspective to them. And the final thing is educate, where I come out to you and say, hey, folks, we are two-kingdom people. God engages the world a certain way, but we need to learn how that is, and then we need to be useful in his hands. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, okay? All right, so I'm going to talk about COVID. I'm going to talk about Equality Act, some of these different things. First, how many of you have had COVID? Yeah, okay, I have too. How many of you know someone who passed away from COVID? Okay, the first dynamic of this discussion is there's a very personal part of this discussion, isn't there? I'm not going to be talking about the personal. There's also a pastoral. I'm not going to even be talking about the pastoral because that's missional, that's evangelism. What I'm talking about is what's the state's role in all these things. Because in reality, the state actually, in a lot of issues today, is taking over the parental role. It's taking over the personal role. It's telling you how you are going to deal with your fears. I always said it this way. I probably should have left this to the end of the presentation. But I always said it this way. The church is an essential organization in our culture. It's a First Amendment organization. The Founding Fathers actually believed that without the church, you couldn't have liberty. Okay? And so when they started saying the church is a non-essential organization, and when your dad or your mom gets sick with COVID and they go in the hospital, a pastor can't go see them because they're non-essential, right? The doctor could see him, the nurse could see him, even the liquor store manager might be able to get in there and see him and give him a nip because that was considered essential. But you as a pastor or a church could not visit anybody in the hospital. And my point was, I'm sorry, but no. Because the last word I want my mom or dad or my friend to hear is not the secular doctor saying, we can't do anything for these people, turn the machine off. That's not the last word of this life. The last word is, and Jesus is here for you. And you're going to walk into Jesus' arms in a minute. And I'm going to read the scripture, and that carries you all the way to that point. So, doctor, if you can put a mask on, if you can put a robe on and go see my father, I can do the same thing because I'm essential. Now, I know that from a biblical point of view, but our culture actually said that too. That's the First Amendment. And so we needed to fight for that right because a lot of people died in loneliness with people outside of the thing saying, we love you, where we should have been able to be in there reading the scripture with them, praying the scripture with them, praying the Lord's Prayer with them until their eyes closed and opened with Jesus. So again, that's the kind of thing we're talking about here. We're not politicizing these things. We're just saying we're not going to let you say that this voice is not essential, especially to my people, but even to my culture, even to my neighborhood. And we're willing to fight for that. How many of you know what the Equality Act is? Raise your hand. All right, good. You guys are pretty aware of this stuff then. How many of you know about the trial that's going on right now between in Finland where the bishop and the, okay. Well, we're going to tell you how to work through these things, okay? Because we tend to get accused of now becoming more political. We're actually not. There's a political aspect to these discussions. There's a pastoral, missional aspect to these discussions, and there's a personal. And knowing which one is the most important and knowing how to put them in their proper place and define them, that's what this is all about. All right, so we're going to basically be talking about being a public Christian from a two-kingdom perspective. I do want to talk about the uniqueness of the American experiment, although that, folks, is a whole lecture. So I'm going to give you one slide and just say, if you want to know more about this, but we do have to teach our kids what is so unique about this culture. It gives us freedoms that other cultures don't give us. We need to put those freedoms to work. And then finally, the opportunities and challenges, okay? Now, the present-day realities, whether you like it or not, is that we do have a culture war going on, okay? Now, a lot of people say, well, we've already lost it, so what's the big deal? I don't really care about winning and losing it, but I care about whether you engage it, okay? And so you could get dropped in any situation. We can be Christians in any culture. I get that. But you are the most effective Christian where you're taking on the culture, where the culture's taking on the church. Because we're losing a lot of people to the culture. They're being told, kids are being told now from kindergarten all the way through high school and then through graduation to college, there is no God. They're being told this. They're being laughed at. I was laughed at in my classes at the University of Michigan. They laughed at my faith in my biology classes. I was a physics major. I was actually on a medical program. I was supposed to, an advanced medical program. I never thought about being a pastor, but they started laughing at my faith. And so I started raising my hand and saying, I don't think that's good science. What are you talking about? But if you don't take up that challenge, then you just sit back like this, and the rest of people start saying, well, there must be no God because none of these Christians stand up for any of this stuff. Well, I wanted to stand up for the God who makes my life worth living, and he makes your life worth living too. It's not about me. I want to stand up for that, but I'm not going to let you silence me. And that's kind of where we're at today with a lot of these issues. So for me, there's a political movement to politicize, demonize, even criminalize basic Christian truth. And I think the Christian church needs to come to grips with that, because I hear all the time, oh, you're hyperbolizing, you're saying that, it's not as bad as you're saying, and I'm saying, actually going to D.C. has taught me behind the scenes it's a lot worse than I thought in many ways, but people are pushing back, and that's a good thing. So actually right now, and I'll give you some good news too, it's the best of times in some ways, and it's the worst of times. So we'll get to that in a minute. So after reading all this, I still get this kind of question. Should we engage? Why would you leave the Lutheran hour to do this? It's a good question. Should we engage? So the first slide that I think really matters to you today is, who's that guy? Walter Meyer. None of our children know who he is. That is a shame. He should be a model for our kids to aspire to, because he was a two-kingdom citizen par excellence. Now, you know him as the Lutheran Hour speaker, and so I was privileged to follow him as the speaker, one of the speakers of the Lutheran Hour. But did you know his left-hand kingdom work, his public cultural engagement work? I bet you didn't. In the 40s, at the height of the Lutheran Hour's success, where he was speaking and the whole nation was listening, they tried to kick him off the air. A bunch of churches gathered, brought charges. They said, and now this is back in a time when actually people thought the church was a useful organization. We want churches. It's the 40s, right? Church was kind of still, Father knows best, all that kind of stuff was still around. But Walter Meyer, he's too sectarian. We got to get him off the air. That was the charge. That Walter Meyer, he kept saying, Jesus, Jesus, only Jesus. Well, we got to get rid of that. Now, what should Meyer have done? Should he have said, well, that's the FCC, and the FCC says I got to go off the air, and they're the state, so the state told me, what am I going to do? No, he fought back. But how did he fight back? He fought back by they basically made this argument to the FCC. They used Jeffersonian freedom principles of the First Amendment to say that we have a right, a responsibility, and a privilege to be on radio. In fact, Meyer even said, because we're doing such a public service, you should even pay for the radio time. Now, they didn't give him that. In fact, they charged us full freight. They actually made us pay more than everybody else. It's amazing. But we did. We raised the money and did it. But he fought back, and he used Jeffersonian freedom principles, First Amendment stuff to keep the Lutheran hour on the air. That's why a lot of your churches still have Lutheran hour signs in the front. If he would have caved, you wouldn't even know what the Lutheran hour is today. That's my point. Walter Meyer took them on, and basically at the end of this process, he helped start the National Religious Broadcasters, which is the largest First Amendment organization in the country today, and the first president was an LLL guy. And we don't even know that history. That's Walter Meyer's other legacy. And I'm trying to honor that legacy by doing some of the same work that he was talking about. Because unfortunately, in Walter Meyer's day, the church was still valued. In our day, the church is seen as a nefarious organization in the culture that does need to be silenced. They would not have gone that far in his day. So should we engage? I'm saying we already have. Let's just get better and better and better at it because we want to be useful in his hands. Now, if you still are having trouble thinking, well, how bad can it be, Pastor? Here's a quote. And again, we really unpack this in the lectures when I come on a Champions. I'm just going to read it. I'm going to get to the point. And sorry for all the words up there, but I tried to make it as easy to read as possible. But this is a guy, you would know his name. Do you know the name Robert Reich? He was in the Clinton organization. I think he was the Secretary of Labor back then. Now he teaches public policy to your children at Berkeley. Okay? So listen to what Reich said. The true battle of the 21st century will be between the modern society and the anti-modernists. Who are you? Anti-modernists, good. And this is, by the way, an op-ed, I think it was in the New York Times. It may have been in the Post, but it's been all over the place. So this is a public document. And this is what's being debated on the Hill, okay? Between those who believe in the primacy of the individual, and he says that's them. Actually, I say we're the ones who have a proper understanding of individualism, but that's another thing. And those who believe that they have an allegiance and identity to a higher authority. See, we need to break all this down, but we don't have time today. But your actual individualism comes from the notion that you have an unalienable rights because you were created by God. Do you know that's where the concept of the public individual came from? And so if you get rid of this notion of allegiance and identity to a higher authority, you get rid of individualism. Yet he says this crazy thought. He goes on. Between those who give priority to life in this world and those who believe human life's a mere preparation for existence beyond, basically he's saying you guys are so heavenly minded you're no earthly damn good. Except if you're heavenly minded, I think you make a big difference this side of heaven. But that's another discussion we could have. And then finally, those who believe in science, reason, and logic, those who believe that truth is revealed through Scripture and religious dogma. Actually, the Christian worldview helped birth modern science. That's another discussion. So right there, you're already thinking, man, he doesn't like the church. But it gets worse. He says, terrorism will disrupt and destroy lives, but it's not the greatest danger we face in the 21st century. You are. Now, if he's going to come up with public policy, do you think he's going to give the church religious liberty freedoms to speak its voice in the culture? Not if he thinks terrorism is not the problem, but the church is. And I call them secular pietists. These are the folks that we're dealing with on the Hill today. You got to if you're going to really deal with these issues that we're going to talk about in just a minute, it's not left and right anymore. It's not liberalism and conservatism. Because old classic liberals believed in truth. They believed in inalienable rights. John F. Kennedy believed in those things. He just had a different way of seeing how the government was part of that. Today, the people we're dealing with are secular statists who don't believe that there's any truth beyond the state and that everything is secular and everything's here and now. And liberals and conservatives of that old way of thinking, they're all a problem. So the more you hear people say, the answer is government, the answer is that, not the family. We need to actually get the family out of that. We need to have these kids dependent on the government. We need to have these kids trained by the government. We need to have government. That's the statist mindset. And they think the church needs to be extinguished if they're going to actually succeed. So dealing with them, and there's a lot of folks even on the Democrat side who don't know this. And I'm saying, take your platform back, you know? Get rid of this stuff from your platform. There's 20 million pro-life Democrats, for instance. Did you know that? 20 million. Take your platform back from these statists. And so again, that work is just the work that we have to do to make sure our public voice is secure. So why? We can preach and teach without fear and coercion so that people can hear about this Jesus. And we'll learn how to do those two things in just a minute. Now, can anybody what makes America unique? Anybody? First Amendment protections, liberty, some of those things. You know what finally makes America unique? Is they believe in the depravity of humanity. And they created a polity that took that into consideration. The French, when they came up with the French Revolution, said that, you know, they did the notion that human beings are tabula rasa and that human beings are by nature good. That's the French Revolution. And they wind up actually in tyranny and cutting each other's heads off. The American Revolution is, no, all of us, even those of us who are winning the revolution, we're sinful and we've got to bind power. We've got to make sure coercive power doesn't root itself in one place or another, or tyranny will ensue. And then they created a government that prevented the tyranny of the monarchy, and they created a government that prevented the tyranny of democracy. We're a constitutional republic. Man, those guys were wise. And then they literally gave up a lot of that to the republic. They gave up their opportunity. Washington could have been a king. And he said, no way. Now, we would spend a lot of time on talking about why that's a pretty cool way. But when you think about that, that means government is bound and the individual, self-governing, religiously motivated citizen is set free. Who's on the top in our constitutional polity? The citizen. When Jesus says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, what they did is, instead of Caesar being up here and you being down here, they turned it upside down. And they said the citizen is Caesar. So you need to engage because you've been given the privilege of it in this culture. And if you give it away to somebody else, they'll create a whole different way of doing this stuff that doesn't honor God's ability to work with us. So again, I would spend some time on that. We don't have time to do that today, but I just want you to know that's what these God-given rights, we have First Amendment rights. We could lose those. I have no, this is not something where if we don't defend all these things and win all these things, we can't be Christians. No, I'm not saying that. But if God has given us those rights and given us those responsibilities, put them to work. I don't want my daughter to have to be scared to go to church in 25 years because you could be punished if you're caught going to church. In the pandemic with COVID, there was some I'm an urban guy. I've been an urban pastor most of my life until Lutheran Hour. There were urban church, all African-American congregations where the police, the mayor of Chicago sent the police to and they were giving them $500 tickets on their cars, and they were pounding on the door because they were locked out. And finally they said, we want to worship. We need to worship. We're in the middle of a crisis. We're coming to church. And she almost punished them out of existence. I love when she actually, when they answered the mayor, she said, why did you lock the door and not let the police in? She said, well, usually you police are never around and a lot of the gangs come running around, so we had to lock the doors for safety. That's the only reason why we locked the doors. But can you imagine being persecuted and poor people being given $500 fines just to go to church? Yeah, because it happened all over the country. Okay? So as we look through these things, we don't look to government generally. Americans, that's our history is not to do that. So again, I just want you to see we could talk a little bit more about why that's such a privilege and how we can put that kind of the gift of those protections to work. I tend to think of those not as protections. I think of them as what? What's a better word? Because protection sounds like this. Don't take it from me. No, it's responsibility. First Amendment responsibilities. That means don't look to them to do it, you do it. Don't look to them to care for the poor, you do it. Don't look to them to care for the foster child, you do it. And First Amendment protects your right to be that kind of ministry. That's what I'm saying. Put it to work for the sake of ministry. So, before we ask questions about COVID, the Equality Act, what are we doing with these things, we have to ask the question, what should we do? No, the first question is, what does God do? And this is where I think we Lutherans have got to start taking our theology more seriously. Our theology is an action theology. Because our theology finally says, this is how God keeps coming. Now that's action, man. Now, a lot of theologies talk about this is what you should do, and this is what you should do, and this is what you should do. I actually need to hear about what God keeps doing first, so that I can then say, what can I do in his name? That's what sacramental theology is. Sacramental theology is the God who comes all the way to where you are, through words, water, bread, and wine, and said, I'm coming for you. And now that you know that I've come and I've delivered it to you, now go and be the delivery point to somebody else. But, man, I want to know about what this God does to people like me. Because if I had to keep coming to him before I did anything good in the world would be a much worse place, right? Well, that's our theology. So let's ask, what would God do? So in a sinful, broken world, how does he engage? So you've got Genesis 1 and 2. You've got the family and the church in Genesis 1 and 2. So they're the institutions that were still part of perfection. The government doesn't come till later. When does the government come? After the fall, and after we get so bad that God's got to put a backstop in there someplace, or we could just go off the deep end. And honestly, that's the main role of government, is to be that backstop that says, you're not going any further than this. In fact, I argue sometimes that the Tower of Babel, when you hear people today, if we just put enough money, enough time, enough government, enough technology together, we can solve all our problems. I hate to tell you this, but the problem is in the human heart. And if sinners can get together and do exactly what they want, they never actually solve the problem. What do? They destroy themselves. And that's why I think in the Tower of Babel, he fractures us, is to protect us from each other. What's the only event in the Bible that brings us all back together? Pentecost. Nothing else in the middle can hold. Even our constitutional protections, as beautiful as they are, they can't ultimately be the center that solves our problems. They might be the center that prevents bad government, but there's got to be a better center that can bind nations and ethnicities and tribes and all selfish people like us together, and that's Christ. But that Christ is the answer to Babel, not Meta, not TikTok. Can you imagine what Mussolini could have done with Facebook? No, I'm serious. Can you imagine what the tyrants of the 20th century could have done with technology? The ability to monitor you. My wife is teaching me all about this phone and what it can do for us. And she said, Greg, I want to teach you how the phone can track us wherever we go. She's trying to keep me out of trouble. And that's okay. I'm okay with that. But I definitely want it to be her that watches that, not somebody else. Right? But they can do that kind of stuff. And I just kept thinking, oh my gosh. So again, it's because of the human heart. The human heart's the problem. So the Founding Fathers said, so don't let that human heart take control of everything coercively. We got to bind that. And hopefully religious people, self-disciplined people, self-governing people will actually do what they're supposed to do for others. All right. So God engages the world. So you got the breakdown of sin that enters the world, and God engages. But when he engages, he does it two ways: preserve and save. Left-hand kingdom, right-hand kingdom. That's what Lutherans call two kingdoms. It's as simple as that. God engages the world to preserve it, because all hell can break loose. It can be much worse, and to save it. And we have to learn how to differentiate those works. And that's what I want to do with you today. We could do a Bible study on this. It actually comes from Matthew 22, where Jesus is confronted, and you guys got to meet Caesar, and Caesar was out there, and the fish and everything, and finally says, give to Caesar, whose image is on there? Caesar's. So give to Caesar what is his, and then give to God what is God's. But really got to understand, he's even saying God is the one who's working even through Caesar. Now, the Founding Fathers, I think, did a good thing for us, because they said, hey, we don't want to have, Caesar shouldn't have that much power. We need to limit Caesar. The Bible actually talks about limiting Caesar too. Like even when Jesus, is before Pilate, and Pilate says, and that's John 18, Pilate says, I can do whatever I want to you, Jesus. And what does Jesus say? You can only do what you've been given to do. And so as citizens, we have the role to play in defining what Caesar's actual work is. And part of my work in D.C. is teaching you how to do that, because we're not saying like, when we get involved in these debates on whether it's marriage or racism or any of these different kind of things, most of the debates that we're getting into on the Hill is, should the government take care of that? Or should it not? And the Founding Fathers said most issues need to be solved in the family, in your own personal life, in the family, with your church people, your neighborhood, and if you have to, maybe the government that's closest to you, city government, neighborhood government, and then maybe state government. And the last place you want to go to solve a problem is the federal government. Do you remember when we were young, we used to say, don't make a federal case out of it? Everything is a federal case now. I used to, instead of talking about COVID, how about even like the speed limit? Remember when they made the speed limit 55 overnight? Do you remember how crazy that was? Now, some of you are older, you know what I'm talking about. The young kids don't know anything about this. Overnight, they said every freeway had to be 55. Are you in West Texas driving 55 from Dallas to Odessa? It'll take you 2 days, maybe 3 years to get there at 55. You feel like you're going backwards. Now I think it's back up to 80. They're very straight roads, very safe, and the cars are very. Again, that just shows from the federal government, in D.C. or L.A., yeah, you never can get to 55, so who cares? But everywhere else, and that's where local, and then finally, hearts that have been changed are going to solve the problems. So again, I thought that was pretty wise stuff. All right, so we would talk more about these things in a three-part series. But right now, I'm just saying we should be fighting for religious liberty without politicizing the gospel. That's what we should be doing. And I don't know that we know how to do that very well. So we Lutherans have got to take our responsibility more seriously. The church is very often caricatured. When people say the religious right, for instance, they'll say the religious right is politicizing the gospel. I've worked with evangelicals on the Hill. I've never heard anybody talk about a theocracy. Not one time. I think maybe there was a time in history they talked about theocracy. Generally speaking, they want good laws. They may think law can do more than I think it can do, because law does not transform. Law only curbs bad behavior. But I've never heard them say that they want their governor to preach Jesus. I've never heard them say that the president should be a pastor, that kind of thing. But I have heard someone say, our caucus is the Matthew 25 caucus. I've heard that. Proudly. Now, see, I got a real problem with that. Because Matthew 25, if you take Matthew 25, it says that you, as Christian people, should do what? You should take care of the poor. If God sends you people, then you care for those people. I don't see anything in there about a government taking my money and serving them in my name. And for someone to say, we are the Matthew 25 caucus, that's a different view of the gospel. Because the government isn't a Matthew 25 entity. You, as a forgiven sinner, and your church as forgiven people, and free people serving one another, that is a benevolencing thing. But when something coerces and then takes and then gives away, that is not benevolence. And so again, people talk about the verses in the Old Testament. Well, that was a theocracy. We don't want to. So again, as we get into these things, we need to learn how to differentiate God's work so that we might be more useful in His hands. So one of the ways that we teach you how to do that is to ask the right engagement questions. And that's what I want to spend some time doing right now. In evangelism, the best engagement question, the evangelicals use this all the time, WWJD. What's that mean? What would Jesus do? It's not a bad way to do it. What would Jesus do? So if I'm confronted by this person, confronted by this challenge, what would Jesus do to actually bring the blessings of God into their life? He would speak the truth in love. He would do these things. He would sacrifice, turn the other cheek, all these different kind of questions. That is not the question you ask when you talk about public policy. The public policy question is, what would the Father have us do to preserve the world so that you can hear about what Jesus has done for everyone? Because those are things like honor your father and your mother. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not. The founding fathers even talked about how all good law has some relationship to the Ten Commandments. Now, you can't legislate the Ten Commandments and solve problems. But if they violate the Ten Commandments, you can be sure that that's not a good law. So if you have a law on the books that says parents don't matter to their children, and there are laws on the books right now that say that you don't need parents, you need this. Well, that cannot in the long run be a good law. It just can't. It violates the law, the way God structures and orders his world, and it's his world. And we Christians have to struggle with the fact that even though we're sinners, just like everybody else, these are still God's laws, and they're still written into the fabric of the culture and the world in which we live. And so you can already see that a lot of what we're dealing with today is not people mad at the church, they're mad at the God who actually says this is the way things are. Okay? So WWFD, actually, we have another paper called WWJRD, and by the way, we have these mom and pop papers about this. So if I say something and you go, gosh, I wish he had a little bit more on that, we have a thing called a mom and pop paper, 500 words, and we explain these things. We have all these different ways of applying our Lutheran way of thinking, and those are on our website. You can just go grab them. I think there's 50 of them for 25. Okay. WWJRDs, what would Jesus really do? He would tell you to do what the Father says. Because Jesus did not come to abrogate. He actually came to fulfill the Father's will. So in terms of he never really even told Caesar what to do. He didn't worry about that. That's the Father actually through Caesar doing the right thing. And you Christians have a role to play, especially in America, to make Caesar do what he's called to do. All right, so we want to seek to be useful in his hands. Lutherans need to learn that we're Romans 12 people. In view of his mercy, what do? Jump in. Evangelistically, we jump into people's lives, and then we share law gospel, and we try to walk with people. Even in the cultural issues, we need to learn how to jump in and say, what does God need us to do to preserve the very culture in which we live for the sake of the mission and ministry of the church? That's tough to do, and that's what I'm saying. My work in D.C. is different than preaching the gospel. I'm not there to preach the gospel. I'm there to put in the proper basement floor of civility so that we can have a culture that can hear the gospel freely, okay? Someone said, there's a book, I just interviewed a guy on our radio program in D.C., and he had a book called The Gospel-Centered Citizen. Is that a good title, do you think? The Gospel-Centered Citizen. I struggle with it because he was an evangelical, and so he doesn't differentiate law gospel the way we do. He doesn't differentiate God's preserving and saving. He tends to kind of think they're kind of the same, even though he doesn't, because the gospel is a unique proclamation. I get that. But I thought, when you say the gospel-centered citizen, I think you get it wrong. Because when we engage the culture, especially for the culture's sake, and putting good law in, it's a law work. So it can be a gospel-motivated citizen, but it's law-centered. When you get involved in these issues, it's trying to put good laws in place for all people so that we can have a civil society and so that the law can begin to do its work and drive us to the gospel. And so that's the work of the left-hand kingdom. And too often we confuse the gospel work of getting involved in people's lives and trying to share Christ-centered work, with Christ-motivated work to make sure the government's doing its job. Do you see how I'm already differentiating? And by the way, that's what makes left-hand kingdom work so hard, because even when you succeed, you don't really feel like you've accomplished much. One guy said, what's the difference between your work today? I said, well, I feel like today I'm always in the pig pen. You might get clean, but you still feel like you're still in the middle of all this stuff. Whereas the gospel is what frees us. It calls us out of the grave. It calls us to a new life. The state has nothing to do with that. So we're trying to put in proper ground floor. And so if I could give you an image, the image would be our law work, our cultural work is to put a proper basement floor in, but the house is built by the gospel. But if you don't have a foundation, the whole thing falls. Okay? All right, so we engage. And that's the picture. Do you see the picture of the pulpit there? It's on the shoulders of what looks like a knight. And I took this picture myself. I still don't know what church it's at. I got to go back and find out. But there's serpents coming up, and the knight, it's actually the angel Gabriel, but he's keeping these serpents at bay so that the pastor can walk up and freely preach and teach the gospel without fear of government intervention or worldly intervention. We need to also train that person, that knight who's doing that work for the sake of the gospel. And you've been given privileges to do that in America, unlike any other culture in the world. Okay? All right, we're going to get there to the COVID stuff in just a second, but I'm trying to give you a framework of how to think about these things, because a lot of people think the government's supposed to solve these issues. We don't. In fact, we're the kind of people who believe that God differentiates his actions, so it puts politics in its proper place. We don't think politics is the end-all answer to a lot of these issues. If it were, there would be no need for Jesus and the cross, because politics is about what you and I can do through policy and money and technology. Well, if that's what saves us, then we don't need Jesus. God differentiates his work, but he also says Caesar has a role to play. It knows that good politics, this is a good Lutheran way of seeing it, good politics cannot save us, but bad politics can destroy us. So again, we're part of the process of keeping bad politics at bay. It views action with a Reformation restraint. I'll talk about that in a minute. If you're going to jump in, you don't have all the answers, because if God is actually working through Caesar, he's working through even non-Christians. If you have good families in your neighborhood, God could be working through those families to keep the peace. He's not going to save the culture through that, but he's going to keep the peace. So don't jump in and think you have all the answers in the left-hand kingdom. God may be keeping things civil through things that are already there. Learn how to enhance that, or learn how to actually bring the special gifts that you have. And finally, this is, I think, the hardest one. This two-kingdom voice, it's a voice that God's created order and his moral ordering of the world is a beautiful thing. That, I think, is the rub. Because right now, we live in a libertine culture, and the libertine culture says, no is a hateful word. So if you tell me no in any way, shape, or form, or if you represent an organization that says no in any way, shape, or form, you don't care about me. Well, the law of God says this is how God created and ordered the world, and to violate these things is what sin is, so you can already see what we're up against. And here's where it becomes tough for you as Christians. You know you're no better than anybody else. So how can I say, honor your father and your mother, and we've got to fight for that, or we've got to actually defend that when we have divorce and we have broken families and we don't even treat each other very well? Well, it's still God's law. It's a different thing to struggle with your sin than to say it's not sin at all. And we have to be the voice of even God's law in the culture if we love the culture. And so again, I think, here's the way, do you know who Chesterton is? G.K. Chesterton? You got to read him, because he is such a great voice for today. He said this, he said, I didn't like I'm paraphrasing now. I didn't like Christianity when I was young because they seemed like they put all these rules and barriers in places, and I didn't like it. But as he got older, he said, I began to realize that God put those barriers in the proper places in my life so freedom could run wild. See, the picture he was saying is, if you take those barriers out and turn the light off, then the Mustangs on the plain they're not running free. They're kind of like this, just trying to hedge their bets. And then, or if they do start running, they may run all over the cliff, to their demise. He said, but God puts the barrier and the fence, and then he turns the light on so the Mustangs can run wild and the wind can be in their manes. He said, that's what God is doing when he says no and says yes on his terms. We've got to be willing to defend that, even though we get curbed by it too, even though we get convicted by it too. If someone says, well, you're just as bad as I am, the answer is you're right. Okay, but this is God's law, and this is God's truth, and it orders us. And we can actually demonstrate how beautiful it is sociologically, psychologically, constitutionally. We can demonstrate how it's been a real blessing. We've got to do that work too. So do you see? But I think this is where Christians are getting, I think this is where Christians are getting hung up. They're scared today because they think they'll be found out as poor representatives of God's law. But it's still God's law. It's a beautiful thing. All right, let me get to a couple of things, and then we'll jump to COVID. We'll jump to the Equality Act. So these are some principles that we use, and we're dynamic differentiation people. We jump in. We want to learn how to jump in Romans 12, but we want to differentiate God's work, and we want to ask the right questions. And that's a process we need to learn how to do. So we don't ask the policeman to turn the other cheek, but we ask the policeman to do his limited role. For instance, someone said, are you a defund the police or a not defund the police person? And here's the Lutheran two-kingdom answer. You ready? How many of you want police on every corner in your neighborhood? I don't. Do you want to have police everywhere so that every time you get out, they're checking how fast you're going? Oh, okay, you're going to get the third or fourth ticket today. So if someone says we want to limit the government's role in your neighborhood, I'm okay with that. But if you limit the government's role in your neighborhood, what must be on the rise? Parents, moms and dads. So where you have strong families, you need less police protection. Where you have weaker families, you need more police protection because you have what I call the 15 to 19-year-old boys high on testosterone. Remember when you were 15 years old, high on testosterone? Your dad was the one who said this far and no farther. Without that dad, the only one left is the policeman. So you can't have destroy the family and defund the police. That will destroy the neighborhood. So I argued this. If you want to lessen the police role, which I can see how you can lessen it. I don't want a police state. But at the same time, then you have to build stronger families. Your policies are destroying the family and destroying the police. You can't do that. That's how we engage that. Sounds like you can talk to both sides of the aisle a bit there, right? Two kingdoms, because we don't expect the government to save us. We're just putting a basement floor in, and we're arguing with people who don't think there should be any basement floor. They're the only people that are our enemies, if you want to use that term. Okay? So dynamic differentiation, jump in, differentiate God's voice, ask the right questions. Reformation restraint, which means when I jump in, I already know God's at work in here to preserve the world. He's not saving it through outward manifestation of the law. But if they've already got good speed limits and they already have, they've incentivized family and they teach kids to have values, that can be a good thing. I don't want to muck that up just because I think I know better. So I jump in with a restraint. There was a pastor, I don't have time to talk about this, but I talk about a pastor in the Ferguson debacle because that's my end of my thesis. I use that as an application. There was a pastor who I think operated under Reformation restraint, and he saved the neighborhood and the police. Cool guy. Not a Lutheran either, but he was doing it. Final one is vocational respect. We could take a whole time and talk about this. All I'm saying finally is the Bible also talks about the curbing power of the law, and your responsibility as God's people is to be that voice in the culture, because the church in many ways is the conscience of the culture. And if the church doesn't tell the state and science how far they can go or not go, they will run over you. We're the curbing power, and God's curbing law, which doesn't save us, but it prevents even worse things from happening. So the libertinism of the 60s is really going to be the challenge, because that's the cultural voice we're up against. Liberty is not libertinism. There'll be a slide on that at the end. So we could talk about the dignity of family, sanctity of life, purpose of property, all that. That's all biblical stuff. All right? Now, this is the last kind of pre-slide to COVID. I actually teach you a grid of engagement. How many of you have trouble talking about anything political at Thanksgiving? Good. That's the way it should be. And Lutherans actually have a grid of engagement where we can say, in this grid, let's talk about it. And if you differ with me, that's no problem. We can still go to the same table and be faithful, even though we actually disagree about this. We have a grid of engagement. There's only a few things that rise to a thus saith the Lord for Caesar. The rest of it is use your sanctified common sense and learn how to be nice to each other. Lutherans generally realize that that's the first two grids, and that's where most of us should be doing our work, and we should be able to talk about that or not talk about that and have a nice Thanksgiving dinner. But when you start talking about religious liberty, which is for everybody, worship God in freedom and truth, when you talk about sanctity of life, those are fundamental things that if a society destroys that, then what are we talking about at all? And even marriage for us is not, we don't want the government to define marriage. We want them to give us the freedom to be faithful to our proclamation of marriage. By the way, you're starting to think about how would Lutherans think this through, right? Remember, we're saying, what's the state's role in our life about this issue? So give me your answer against gay marriage. What would you say? Now, some people say, we got to define marriage the way it is. We got to make sure that the government defines that. There's some truth to that, because I think marriage is between a man and a woman for life. Yes, that's what the Bible says. And you start to violate that at your peril and at your community peril. Okay. But what we're really arguing with in the gay marriage debate is, what's the state's role in marriage? And so I ask people, what does the state do? They go, it grants rights. Wrong. The state undergirds the rights you already have, right? So the second thing is, if a state is taking away your rights, because that's what states do for the sake of the common good, why would they take away the rights of a man and a woman and make them sign a contract called marriage? What's the answer to that? Someone says taxes. No, that's not it. What's the answer? The answer is, you're the only relationship that can go to bed tonight and tomorrow wake up and have a new citizen. Because that's part of the physiological reality of man and woman. So you could go to sleep tonight and tomorrow have a new citizen, and the state doesn't want to raise your citizen. So they make you sign a contract and be dedicated to that child so that we can have a healthier society. They limit your rights because of the child. And so our argument was, and this was argued to the Supreme Court, if you can't leave your nefarious hands out of the relationship, if you're going to try to expand it beyond a man and a woman, you as a state should get out of the whole business. But to go to the point where they now define what marriage is, and they define what a healthy relationship is, do you know some of these people on the Hill, do you want them defining that for you? Do you see our argument? I even had some activists who disagreed with our view of marriage say, we agree with your view of what the state should be involved in. And that would allow us to be free, to be ourselves, and to consecrate marriage the way God wants us to be faithful, and to try to demonstrate why our view of marriage is better for everybody else. Right now, Finland has defined marriage as a relationship of two people. Maybe someday it'll be 3, 4, 5, or 6 people, and anybody who stands against that are guilty of a hate crime, and you have a bishop who's a faithful, loving, wonderful person, and you have a politician who are on trial and could be jailed for 2 to 3 years and could have unlimited funding taken away from them because they teach biblical marriage. We don't want that here. We don't want secular blasphemy laws here, and they are coming if we don't stop it. But that was our argument. Just get out of the whole business. And so again, we have a different way of looking at these things, and I would take some time to show you this grid of engagement if we had time today, but if you want, that's part of my Champions for Liberty discussion, okay? And so I just want you to know that we have, again, with Two Kingdoms, we have a way of actually saying that's something we can disagree about and we can be friends. This is something that we've got to stand together, and there's only a few of those, but let's stand firm because they bless everyone. Okay? Not just us. All right, so WWJD, WWFD, those kind of questions. Now let's talk about what's going on in the culture. We are the live and let live people, folks. Did you know that? LCMS people are the live and let live people. In politics, that's true. We're basically saying we'll fight for these things. We want to come to an agreement on this, but we're not going to actually weaponize politics if you disagree with us. We're not going to weaponize, and we're not going to make the power of the state coercive and start to coerce your conscience difference with me. That's us. There is a group now that says, no, we're going to annihilate all legitimate differences by weaponizing it. So if you do disagree with our view of marriage, or you do disagree with libertinism, which means, you know, even, it's not just the LGBT movement. Now I can't even preach that you can't live together. I mean, let's bring it closer to home. You know, we got people today saying we can have sex on the first date. That's just what intimacy, you know, sex is just a game. We just play the game, and hopefully someday we'll fall in love, and then we'll have, no, it doesn't work that way. You leave, you cleave, and then the intimacy comes, right? Well, that's what we teach. No, you can't teach it because someone's going to get offended, and that's a hate crime. That's where this is going. Any statement of no, God says no, so he can say yes on his terms is not allowed. That's not us. So when you hear people say we're politicized, we're becoming more political. No, we're not. We're trying to keep politics out of these questions. But we have to fight for that today. And so there's a usurpation of representative government, and that's where we start to talk about COVID. But do you remember Prop 8? Prop 8 was California voting for religious, or the biblical, the Families Act, where they were actually fighting for a traditional definition of marriage in California. Let me ask you the question. Did that law pass, or was it defeated in California? It passed. And then a judge disenfranchised all those voters. Did you know that 75% of black people voted for traditional marriage, 75% of Hispanic people voted for it, and they were disenfranchised? That's Jim Crow. And nobody heard boo about it. Well, unless they talked to you, because you said that's bad government. It should never have happened that way. And then COVID was starting to do that, where they started to actually say the church is not an essential organization. So in my work in D.C., I understand the pastoral role in this. COVID scared the daylights out of a lot of us, right? At first, we thought it was like Ebola. We thought we were going to all die from it if we just got it. And I was looking for the science. I was going online trying to actually research these things. I eventually signed on to the Barrington document. If you want to know about it, it's a bunch of doctors, epidemiologists who actually looked at this. Their argument was that herd immunity is actually the only way to overcome this, but there were people who were in real danger. We need to protect those folks and then let everyone else get back to work. And these are guys from Stanford. These are guys from Harvard. These are not, and they were actually dismissed. But I think they were right all the way through, and that's being proven. But the point was, COVID was not, you can argue with me about that. If you have a personal relationship with COVID, obviously I'm not going to tell you whether you should get over it or not. You have your experience of that, and you need to work through that. I generally think it would have been better to work through with your doctor, with your family, and with your church. But there was an early on time where the government had some role to play because we didn't know what was going on. And we honored that. Where we're at now is governments started saying, you can't be church. But they let other people be who they were. They started to say, we're not an essential organization. And I said, First Amendment says we are. And we started to actually fight with people around the country, and we would not let them get away with that. Because once you let them define you as non-essential, then that's part of the way they put the church in the basement. And so we fought that. All I'm saying is if I do my job, I'm keeping your public space free so you can what? Speak the whole counsel of God without fear. You still got to do all that work. I'm not doing that, but I'm going to try to make sure that we keep your voice publicly free because our world needs to hear it. All right, so here's some of the things that we've been involved. If you think we've never been involved, we've been involved in huge issues in our culture. Back in the day, the state of Nebraska actually sued the Lutheran Church. We'll talk more about that if you have a champions thing. But Walter Meyer, the Lutheran, I talked about that. Hosanna Tabor. By the way, they're attacking Hosanna. They're coming after the Hosanna Tabor ruling. Because the Hosanna Tabor ruling is if you're a Christian, you can hire Christians. If you're a Lutheran, you can hire Lutherans. And if they don't want to teach Lutheran stuff in your school, you can say you're fired. That's Hosanna Tabor. That's the protection that Hosanna Tabor gave to you. It was a reaffirmation of the First Amendment. There are people trying to get rid of Hosanna Tabor right now. Which means that if someone teaches something that violates what you teach, you can't fire them under certain definitions. What? And so again, we get into some of these issues. But we were the test case for that. And can we actually hire people who will carry on our tradition? And then Trinity Lutheran was that the church cannot be discriminated because it's just a church. And that again was a Trinity Lutheran case, a Lutheran church that had a preschool that just wanted to have ground-up tires for their playground, and they were just like everybody else. And the only reason they didn't get it is because they found out they were Christian. Well, that's a discrimination of Christianity, not a neutrality. So again, we've been involved in these things. But here's where it's getting nasty. Masterpiece Cake Shop, you'd know about that. The guy that made the cake wouldn't make the cake. They're still suing him. He's won every time, but they're bankrupting him and suing him, all because he will not make something against his conscience. Now, anybody walks into his shop, he'll serve you, he'll sell you anything in the shop, but if you say, I would like to have a phallic symbol made for my cake, he says, I don't do that. The specialty cakes I make, I have limitations to that, conscience limitations. And he just wouldn't make one for a gay wedding. Now, here's the Lutheran answer. Why are they suing this guy? He's discriminating. No, the answer is, why does every deli need to be kosher? You see what I'm going? We wrote a mom and pop paper. Why does every deli, I walk into your deli and you don't have kosher meat, then I'm suing you because you didn't have kosher meat the way I wanted kosher meat. No, there's kosher meat right down there. So it's about access. So if there's plenty of places that will make the cake, why are you discriminating against this one guy who has a conscience difference with making the cake? And there's 20 bakeries right around the corner that'll make his cake. Why does every deli need to be kosher? In a world where we can have conscience disagreements about major issues, we should be able to learn how to be. And by the way, if you meet Jack, he is the nicest, caringest, most wonderful. If you don't think that, then I'll give you the Baronel Stutzman case. If you don't think this is nefarious, Baronel Stutzman's a 77-year-old grandmother who has been serving people in her neighborhood out west for a whole lot of years in her florist shop. And she had two gay friends who came in and said, we want you to do the flowers for our wedding. And she said, I love you guys, but I don't believe in that view of marriage, so I can't do that. And they said, it's okay, Bernal, we love you, we know you love us. And they went away. They did not sue her. The state came in because they heard about the fact that she disagreed with it, and the state came in and they bankrupted a 77-year-old grandmother. Now, if you're okay with that, a person who was loved by the community, even loved by the people who actually disagreed with her on marriage, they love her, and they were aghast that the state came in. Didn't matter. The state came in and said, we got to shut you down. That's the state out of control. We need to push back on those kind of things. And finally, Obergefell and Bostock, that was the marriage ruling. We were told that all it was to do was to give rights to people who had a different view of marriage of us. It's now being used as a club to say, if you don't teach this in your schools, if you don't teach this in your universities, we can shut you down. We were told it was never going to do that. It was just going to be a narrow ruling to protect certain people, to give them the rights that you already have. And so people went with that. Our argument was get the state out of marriage business. And now what's happening is the activists, and I'm not talking about people who struggle with the lifestyle. I'm talking about the activists. The activists are coming in, they're taking Obergefell and saying, you're not going to teach this? That's hate crime. It's unconstitutional. You can't be a school. That's how this stuff works in politics, okay? All right, so the Equality Act then is that it's really this notion that if you don't teach the new libertine view of marriage, if you don't teach the new libertine view of these issues, you can be shut down. It's moving to what I call secular blasphemy laws. Right now, the Virginia Values Act, I just was on a phone call yesterday back in D.C. I did not realize, it's worse than I thought. The Virginia Values Act, the secular progressives, if you will, of Virginia, got hold of all branches of government, and they passed about 1,500 laws in about 2 months. And they literally put these things in place. And so now Christian schools are on alert, because now if you actually teach uniforms, girls wear dresses, boys wear shorts or pants. And a little boy says, I want to wear a dress, and you say you can't wear a dress, you could have a lawsuit that afternoon, $100,000 per incident, unlimited damages. Same thing with the teaching of marriage. If you will not amend your teaching of marriage, we can actually not certify you or not credential you. And that's the kind of stuff that's coming through this. And we're saying, why are you doing this to us? We just have a different view of these things. And the answer is because you're a nefarious actor. You're the church. Go back to the quote, okay? And so all we're saying is we're not going to let you have that. We're not going to let you run over our space and take that space away. I even had a politician say, if you're a Christian, you can't serve in government. Do you remember that discussion? A Christian was asked, are you a believer in Jesus? Yes. Do you believe Jesus is the only Savior? Yes. Then why should I let you be in government, because you'll only serve Christians? What's the two-kingdom answer? See, he went, I love you. He sounded like he was caught. The answer is, well, sir, we don't ever ask the government to proclaim the good news of Jesus. That's completely separate from the government. In fact, faith has nothing to do with the government. But moral stuff, but God tells us when we get involved in those moral things with one another that we should even love our enemies. So I think, our religion can actually serve all people. You, sir, can only serve your constituents, because you despise the other side of the aisle. I can serve both sides with this perspective. Can you imagine someone saying that? And that's what I'm saying. We need to be better at testifying about God's truths in the moral realm, and then God's truth in what he has done for us. I understand we're going to have a certain reticence because we're just as broken, but we can say to people, we know this doesn't save us, but it can prevent the worst aspects of all of our desires. And we're not saying that the church is going to suddenly make us the better people. We're actually yearning for God's best for us that can really save us. So again, Soji laws are challenging God's view of male and female. Soji laws are challenging God's view of marriage. Soji laws are doing that, and they're really talking about these things in a libertine way. We're going to have to engage that because it finally actually challenges the gospel itself. Because the gospel is this notion that only Jesus is the Savior. And that, too, by definition, is hate speech. Okay? So again, we push back for the sake, but again, we're not defensive. We're trying to be useful in God's hands for the culture and for the church. And so, I think this is where we're at. We've got to push back on this stuff. If you see, judge platforms, not people. Look at the platform. If the platform is anti-family, if the platform it suddenly is going after basic teachings of the church, if it's criminalizing those things, I think you have to say, what? No. And push back on that for the sake of everybody. Religious liberty is religious liberty for everyone, not just for us. Conscience protections are for everyone. Right now, the people that are anti-vax in the military, do you know that the only people not being given accommodations are religious liberty people? I know you've heard that some gave them 3. Those people were actually leaving already. So that was just political cover. They're being given administrative accommodations, they're being given medical accommodations, and they're being refused when they're religious accommodations. Excuse me, but the First Amendment is all about religious accommodation, not about medical accommodation, and surely not about administrative accommodation. But that's the one that is actually being neglected. We have people that are losing their livelihoods today because of their willingness to stand on First Amendment stuff. We support them, we work with them, but the government's a very powerful entity. And our founding fathers said, don't let it get too big. And so the end game of libertinism, which is the foundation behind all this stuff, the destruction of parenthood, of parental authority. There's a book called Get Out Now. I'll put up books on our website if you want a list of some of these books, because I researched this stuff pretty well. These are educators telling you what's going on in the public school system who've been in education for 25, 30 years. They're saying, you don't know what's coming. Well, we do now because we've actually seen the curriculum. But when we talk about these, the destruction of the family is a building block of society. Our big beef with BLM, you know, when they talk about Black Lives Matter, or they talk about racism, we're not, yeah, there's an issue. What's your solution? If you want to get into an issue of this, that was my work for 25 years as urban ministry. My first thing is I say, what's your view of parental choice in education? That's my first thing out of my mouth. Because black families want it, black children need it, and it's the one way out of poverty. And you know that's the one thing that is actually anathema to the supposed people who care about the poor. And Black Lives Matter's main role is to actually destroy the family protections and actually make people more dependent on that kind of governmental oversight. I don't want that. That destroys good people. So the destruction of all moral norms concerning behavior and the reclassification of the church as a nefarious actor in the public square. I think we got to do more work of saying, you know, look, we're not saying we're good people in the sense that we're any better than you, but God's laws actually are a blessing too. Even as they curb us, even as they convict us, they are a blessing. Healthy families are a blessing. People who actually love their wives and husbands are a blessing. Private property, so I have something to give, is a blessing. You know, all these things can be argued sociologically, psychologically. We have to do a better job of that. We know it doesn't save, but it starts to put those proper curves in place so that freedom can run wild, especially the freedom to run to the Lord who's already running to you. Oops, what did I just do? Okay, so COVID in the church, they challenged our essentiality. That's what I was fighting on the hill. So I'm not going to let you have that. I'm not going to cower to that, because once you cower the church into the basement, then you're saying that the last word my father gets to hear in the hospital is a secular doctor who says, turn the machine off, he's done. I'm sorry, I got something else to say. And I will be in that room saying it because that's my job. Pastors, we have held the hands of people who died while we were there talking with them. I know it's a scary thing. I know it's frightening, but that's our job. I also know that we had people who were afraid of COVID, and then we also had people who said, man, this COVID's no big deal. I know it's pastorally hard to deal with those fears. But that's pastoral ministry, and so we have to learn how to deal with each other, and we have to try to deal with each other's struggles and fears and all those things. But I don't want the government coming in and telling me how I'm going to do that with my people. And so even early on, we were fighting for your essentialness, and then we were instructing pastors to work with their elders, to come up with a plan, work with their circuits and their counselors. And then if the governor said, you're not going to be church, but we're going to leave the liquor store open, and we're going to leave the casinos open, and you're going to be closed, we fought for you to keep you open. We told you how to actually engage this. It's not easy. Pastoral work is really hard. But the big thing was we're not going to let them declassify you as non-essential, because our culture needs it. When World War II breaks out, even when the Spanish flu broke out, people went to church. They prayed. And the government's saying, you don't need to do that anymore. Oh, yes, we do. All right? So science is the final guide. That's also what the attack was. By the way, folks, science will not solve your problems. It's just not going to. It can tell you lots of things. It's a beautiful thing. I love science. But science tells you that something is. It doesn't tell you whether it's right or wrong. DNA. I had one woman say this to me one time. How do you know something's true? She said, DNA. I said, So if I have the gun and I shoot you, and my DNA is on the gun, yeah, I shot you. Why is that wrong? See, science doesn't tell you that's wrong. It's thou shalt not kill that tells you that's wrong. It's thou shalt not use force against, innocent people. That's wrong. That's why abortion is a wrong thing, because it's the first time the state is protecting the powerful so that they can destroy the weak. The argument on abortion is so cockeyed, is if you're vulnerable, you can be killed. But the state is supposed to protect the vulnerable. That's the role of the state. So you look at these things, science is the final guide. No, science tells you that certain things are. There's still a moral dimension. How many of you drove the speed limit coming here? And you look at your speedometer, all it tells you is that you're going 65 or that you're going 25. If you're going 25 on the freeway, you're going to get a ticket. If you're going 75 in the parking lot, you're going to get a ticket. That's a different question. Again, we bring that perspective into the public square, and it's a good thing to talk about. And then finally, the material here and now is the only thing that matters, and the state is the final arbiter of such questions. That's who we're dealing with on the Hill. They're not liberals. They're not conservatives. They're secular statists, and they believe the state is the end-all answer. The problem I have with that is that view killed 100 million people in the 20th century. This idea that socialism and Marxism is such a wonderful, if it just was practiced correctly, it's such a beautiful thing. No, it isn't. Read this book by Thomas Sowell. It's called A Conflict of Visions. Marxism, like all these other isms, these utopian isms, believe that human beings are good and they just need better structures. If you have good structures and you have innocent human beings, then you'll have a perfect society. And so the problem is never you, the problem is the structure. That's why they want to dismantle America. Our view is we're the problem. Broken human hearts are the problem. And so the conflict of visions is if you have this unlimited utopian view of humanity or this broken view of humanity, you're going to come up with different politics. And Thomas Sowell says, how can you argue that there's a utopian reality? It sounds good, it just doesn't work. And so that utopian reality killed 100 million people of its own people last century. Why would you want to bring that here? That doesn't mean our culture is perfect, but it allows us to actually treat each other as human beings and strive for that. So finally this then, what to do? Personal, pastoral, missional. We actually emphasize those things closest to home are the place where you should do the work. And politically too, whatever's closest to home, that's where you take care of these issues. But folks, we need to actually start doing our own foster care stuff. We need to start doing the adoption agencies like we've always done. We need to do our schools. We need to do the boys' clubs and the girls' clubs. Those were all free association solutions to problems. We don't need the government solution to come in. In fact, one of the things that happened, one of the big cases I wrote on, they were going to shut down the Catholic adoption agencies in Pennsylvania. The Fulton case. Do you understand that that would have taken a huge service out of the whole state of Pennsylvania, and those kids would have just been thrown back into the system, and they didn't care. And there's no secular thing that would replace. What? There's a book, again, it's on the reading list, but they did an analysis. Christians, when they go serve in the neighborhood, they're doing it out of their faith. They're not doing it for money. They're not doing it for position. They're not doing it for glory. They may not do it real well, but they're there, and they're trying their best. When you pull all them out, there is no secular alternative that just comes in, because they're doing it for a job. They're doing it for policy. There's not enough people who think that way. But those who think, I got to serve my neighbor, they do. So we fought for that. What not to do? Don't shirk your responsibility. What's the government to do? Should they? That's the question. Should. It may be that this is something we have to do. The question is, should they do it or should you do it? Should they do it or should the church do it? Should they do it or should free associations do it? That's where you need to argue these things. And most people, if you hear a person say the answer is this policy, this state, the government does it, chances are you're dealing with a statist. And you have to argue that back to the personal and to the family and to the neighborhood. And then, so what should government not be doing? The government is the worst benevolencing organization in the culture, because by definition, it's coercive. You can't be a loving entity if you coerce love. And so benevolence comes from free people, benevolence comes from church, benevolence comes from free association. And the founding fathers said, let's set that free and let's bind this. And that's the challenge for today. So in closing, I just say this, let's go all Walter Meyer on them. We need to learn how to do this, folks. And by the way, I'm challenging our universities. We've got to start saying, look at this guy. He's the best example of a two-kingdom citizen. And he was at one time, the president asked for his advice on issues. He spoke to people. I got this great story, Walter Meyer. Do we have time? Okay. Walter Meyer speaks about two kingdoms, and it had to do with prohibition, so I don't usually lead with that. But we actually fought, to get it repealed, which is fine. And he did two kingdoms. And after he was done, Clarence Darrow liked what Walter Meyer said. Now, who's Clarence Darrow? Scopes trial. And by the way, we won that. And Inherent to Win is exactly the opposite of what happens. Read what Oliver Wendell Holmes said. Some of the stuff he said was powerful. Now, if you watch the 1960s movie, he's a bumbling idiot. But that's because that's what Christians are portrayed as, all the way back to the 60s. But anyway, Clarence Darrow likes what Walter Meyer says. What? Remember, two kingdoms. So Darrow's people said, debate Walter Meyer. Debate him. And so they send a thing. Walter Meyer says, anytime, anywhere, anytime, anywhere. Long story short, Darrow backed out. But can you imagine at a moment like ours today, think of a public figure that really speaks, and then think of one of our pastors debating them on the public square. See, Darrow found out he was a Harvard-trained Semiticist. He had a PhD from Harvard, that he was this brilliant guy, and he thought, man, I don't want anything to do with that. But again, we should be in the mix like that. You see what I'm saying? And so we should be teaching our left-hand kingdom kids, our entrepreneurs, our bankers, our business people, our professionals, we should be teaching them their left-hand kingdom work. They know how to deal with politics. They know how to deal with regulatory agencies. They know how to keep this stuff at bay so that the church can be free. And we got to train them to be that aspect of it, so that they can be like that knight keeping the serpents at bay, so the pastor, teacher, DCE can speak the gospel freely so everybody can hear. And that's what we're about. That's our educational aspect. And I'm challenging even our schools to start to actually create these kind of kids for 21st century mission and ministry. So in closing, I just tell you the point is we got to be defensive to some degree, because there is a certain attack coming on. But we have to turn that attack around. We don't want to be defensive. We're not protecting ourselves. We want to keep this voice out there in the public square, because this is God's voice that blesses, it preserves, and it saves. And so we've got to be willing to be those kind of people so that people can actually hear this. So speaking the truth in love, always be ready to give an account. And this is what I call left-hand kingdom evangelism. It still serves the church when we put God's curbing power of the law in its proper place in our culture, so that it blesses everyone. And to that end, I say, go with the Lord and differentiate his work and be useful in his hands. God bless you. Thank you all for staying. Appreciate it a lot. I got one last thing to tell you. The good news. I was talking to a lawyer who actually won the Bladensburg case. Do you know the Bladensburg case? There's that cross they tried to actually cut down in Maryland, and we won. He said, after I was interviewing him, he said, this is the best time in my lifetime for religious liberty protections for the church. I said, oh, come on. He said, no, Greg. And he's the lead lawyer for the Bladensburg case. He said the Bladensburg case now the Supreme Court has put in protections now in such a way that it's now back to the way the First Amendment was meant to be read, which is to prevent the church from the state, not the state from the church. The Lemon Law was gutted in Bladensburg, and he was the lead lawyer, so I'm getting it straight from him. And he said, on my radio program, he said, I never thought I would see this in my lifetime. This is the best time in my life for religious liberty protection. So that's going on. That doesn't mean these other attacks aren't coming, but we now have protections that God has given us again, so it might be another generation before they can do another swing at us. So that's good for your kids and your grandkids too. God bless you.